Picture this: the bizarre case of Louis XIV, the Sun King who rotted alive. What if I told you that the most powerful man in 17th century Europe, a king so magnificent that foreign ambassadors literally swooned in his presence, ended up as a 300-pound rotting mass of gangrenous flesh that made diplomats vomit during royal meetings? What if I told you that this transformation from golden god to walking corpse was so horrific that French historians allegedly covered it up for over 4 centuries? Well, buckle up, because today we're diving into the most shocking royal scandal you've never heard of. The absolutely disgusting downfall of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. I'm talking about a man who could dance ballet for 6 straight hours without breaking a sweat, who spoke 5 languages fluently, who could remember the names of 3,000 nobles, and whose natural masculine scent was described as literally intoxicating. This was a king so physically perfect that the entire palace of Versailles was designed as a stage just to showcase his divine presence. But by the end, courtiers were wearing perfumed masks just to be in the same room, and the stench was so overwhelming that fresh flowers had to be replaced every 2 hours throughout the entire palace. We're talking about a smell so putrid it could be detected from the palace gardens. And here's the tea. Secret medical records that were supposedly destroyed centuries ago were actually decoded in 1987, revealing the most disturbing royal health crisis in European history. We're about to expose how the most beautiful king in the world became a literal nightmare. And trust me, this story gets darker than you could ever imagine. Let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. It's 1661, and 23-year-old Louis XIV is standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and I'm not exaggerating, and I say this man was a walking work of art. We're talking 5'8" of pure physical perfection, rippling muscles, gleaming black hair, and piercing bright blue eyes that contemporaries compared to shooting stars. His voice was so commanding it could be heard clearly from 150 feet away, and when he walked, his confident stride literally made the floors vibrate. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing him as having the appearance of a god who had descended to earth. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. This wasn't just about looks. Louis XIV was operating on a superhuman level that honestly makes modern celebrities look like amateurs. This man was fluent in French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German. He was such a master swordsman that he regularly outfenced his Italian tutors, who were supposedly the best in Europe. He could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without showing any signs of fatigue, then immediately turn around and write poetry so beautiful it moved hardened diplomats to tears. And the physical capabilities? Absolutely insane. This man consumed 4 full meals plus snacks daily while maintaining that perfect physique. He would hunt for 8 hours straight, then dance until 3 in the morning like it was nothing. His memory was so extraordinary that he could recall the names and faces of thousands of courtiers instantly. And his romantic appetite? The records suggest he was with 12 different women monthly, and apparently none of them had any complaints. The morning ritual alone will blow your mind. Picture this. Over 100 of the most powerful nobles in France competing for the honor of participating in the king's wake-up ceremony, called the lever. This wasn't just getting dressed. This was a choreographed performance where 10,000 courtiers would gather daily, moving in perfect synchronization around their divine king. The evening coucher ceremony was equally elaborate, with the Hall of Mirrors specifically designed to multiply his presence so that his magnificence could be appreciated from every possible angle. This was a man so confident in his physical perfection that he refused to bathe because he believed water weakened the body and allowed evil spirits to enter. He considered his natural body odor a sign of masculine power, and honestly, based on contemporary accounts, it actually worked. Foreign visitors described his natural scent as intoxicating and irresistible. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn, and this is where those secret medical records that were decoded in 1987 start revealing some seriously disturbing details. By age 25, the Sun King was requiring 2 to 3 enemas daily. His legendary appetite had turned into chronic overeating. We're talking 6 to 8 full meals daily, causing severe constipation that required constant medical intervention. His breath had become so foul that he needed peppermint candies constantly, and he was developing skin problems that had to be hidden under increasingly heavy makeup. But the real nightmare begins on January 5th, 1686, when the 37-year-old king woke up with what his doctors initially dismissed as a small hemorrhoid. Within 1 week, this small discomfort had progressed to severe pain, bleeding, and swelling. By February 5th, courtiers were beginning to notice a strange odor coming from the king's direction during court ceremonies. By February 12th, there was visible drainage of pus and fecal matter, and the man who once smelled like a god was beginning to smell like death itself. Now you might think that the most powerful man in Europe would have access to the best medical care available, right? Wrong. What happened next is so medically horrific that it reads like something from a torture manual. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the royal physician, decided to treat the king's condition with over 2,000 cold water enemas over 6 months. When that didn't work, he moved on to red-hot iron cautery, literally burning the infected tissue while the king was fully conscious. But wait, it gets worse. The treatments included forced bloodletting of 500 milliliters daily. That's more than a pint of blood every single day. The concoctions they forced him to consume? Bull's sperm mixed with wine, bull's blood mixed with crushed pearls, and frog fat dissolved in brandy. Every single one of these treatments not only failed, but actively made his condition worse. By November 1686, the situation had become so desperate that they brought in Charles-François Felix, supposedly the best surgeon in France. But here's the part that will absolutely shock you. Felix was so terrified of operating on the king that he practiced the procedure on 75 prisoners first. 75 human beings used as test subjects so that he could perfect his technique on the royal body. They even created a custom silver scalpel called le bistouri, specifically for the king's surgery. On November 18, 1686, Louis XIV underwent the first surgery without any anesthesia. 3 hours of conscious torture while courtiers physically held him down as Felix cut into gangrenous tissue. The king's screams could be heard throughout the palace, but he never once asked them to stop because showing weakness would have shattered the divine image he had spent decades building. But one surgery wasn't enough. The wound wouldn't heal properly, so they had to operate 3 more times. December 6th, 8th, and 10th. The final surgery lasted 6 brutal hours, bringing the total surgical time to 15 hours spread over 3 weeks. Can you imagine? 15 hours of conscious surgery in the 17th century with no pain relief whatsoever. The aftermath was even worse than the surgeries themselves. Louis XIV was left with a permanent anal fistula that caused continuous drainage. The man who once had an intoxicating natural scent now smelled like rotting death 24 hours a day. Foreign diplomats began avoiding royal audiences, and those who couldn't avoid them would often vomit during meetings. The palace was spending the equivalent of $2 million annually in modern terms, just on perfume and air fresheners. The desperate attempts to mask the smell became absolutely ridiculous. Fresh flowers were replaced every 2 hours throughout the entire palace. Scented smoke was burned continuously in every room the king might enter. Furniture was sprayed with perfume before he sat down. His food was infused with aromatic oils. Courtiers carried special scented balls called pomanders, and many foreign diplomats started requesting that meetings be held outdoors. And through all of this horror, Louis XIV's body began to transform in the most shocking way possible. His weight exploded from 165 pounds in 1670 to 265 pounds by 1700, and finally to 310 pounds by 1710. It took 6 men to lift him onto his horse. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times to accommodate his increasing size. Court artists were given strict instructions to use only the most flattering angles, and foreign visitors were writing brutal observations about both his appearance and his smell. But just when you think this story couldn't get any more disturbing, we reach 1693, and what I can only describe as a dental catastrophe of epic proportions. Dr. Diakin, clearly following the medieval medical principle of, when in doubt, make it worse, decided to extract all of the king's teeth in a single session. Not only did he rip out every tooth, but he also tore part of the upper palate and fractured the lower jaw, creating a permanent hole between the king's mouth and nasal cavity. The result? Food and wine would spray from his nostrils when he tried to eat. His speech became slurred, and nearly impossible to understand. He drooled constantly from his toothless mouth. The man who once commanded rooms with his voice could barely make himself understood. Foreign ambassadors were writing home describing meetings where they couldn't comprehend what the king was trying to say through his mangled speech. The court protocols that developed to hide the king's condition became absolutely insane. They created over 200 new rules and procedures specifically designed to conceal what was happening to their divine monarch. They developed a color-coded ribbon system to warn courtiers about the king's condition. Red ribbons meant stay away because he was in severe pain. White ribbons meant you could approach but needed aromatic masks. And black ribbons meant he was having severe bowel problems and the entire area was off limits. The morning lever ceremony was shortened from its traditional elaborate ritual to just 30 minutes because the king couldn't maintain his composure for longer. The evening coucher was modified to allow for frequent changes of padding and undergarments. They strategically placed curtains throughout the palace to hide soiled clothing and arranged windows to create air currents that would disperse the smell as much as possible. Can you picture this? 500 bowls of flowers being replaced hourly throughout the palace. 50 perfume machines operating constantly. Every courtier carrying scented balls just to breathe. Foreign diplomats literally requesting outdoor meetings because they couldn't handle being indoors with the king. This was the Sun King, the divine monarch, the most powerful man in Europe, reduced to a walking biological disaster that his own court couldn't stand to be around. But somehow, despite all of this horror, Louis XIV continued to govern. He continued to hold court, make decisions, and project the image of divine authority even as his body was literally falling apart around him. The level of denial and determination required to maintain this facade is honestly mind-blowing. And then we reach the final act of this nightmare beginning on August 11, 1715, when the 76-year-old king woke up complaining of leg pain. His doctors, clearly having learned nothing from decades of medical disasters, diagnosed it as sciatica. It wasn't sciatica. It was senile gangrene, and it was about to consume the Sun King in the most horrific way possible. By August 15th, black spots were appearing on his toe. By August 18th, the black spots were spreading and his skin was burning. By August 22nd, there was a new smell, the distinct odor of rotting flesh that was somehow even worse than what they'd been dealing with for the past 30 years. By August 25th, the black discoloration had reached halfway up his foot. On August 28th, his big toe literally fell off. And here's the part that absolutely breaks my mind. Foreign ambassadors were actually traveling to Versailles, specifically to witness this royal decline. International observers were documenting the gruesome spectacle of the Sun King rotting alive. Courtiers were wearing perfumed masks just to enter his presence. Bed linens were being changed every 2 hours because of the continuous drainage and decay. The stench was so powerful it could be detected from the palace gardens. By August 30th, the gangrene had reached his shin, and still, Louis XIV continued to hold audiences and conduct state business. Can you imagine the willpower required to maintain royal dignity while your body is literally decomposing around you? The man was governing an empire while parts of his body were falling off. September 1st, 1715, marked the final day of this 30-year medical nightmare. By 7 in the morning, the gangrene had spread to his throat muscles, making speech nearly impossible. His final words to his great-grandson were prophetic. "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." His last audible words were a desperate plea. "Oh my God, come to my aid. Hasten to help me." At 8:15 a.m., Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most beautiful king in the world, finally died. But even death couldn't end this horror show. The body began decomposing so rapidly that it was swelling from bacterial gases within hours. Dr. Marischal performed an autopsy just 6 hours after death and found gangrene throughout the entire left side of the body, severe intestinal issues, and a massive tapeworm. The embalmers faced an impossible task because of the rapid decomposition, so the coffin was sealed immediately and reinforced with lead. And here's a detail that will give you nightmares. During the lying in state ceremony, people reported hearing strange sounds coming from inside the sealed coffin as the decomposition process continued. Now, here's where the cover-up begins, and this is the part that makes this story even more incredible. Within 48 hours of the king's death, there was a systematic destruction of evidence that would make a modern scandal look amateur. Official announcements claimed the king had died peacefully after a brief illness. Dr. Fagan's medical records were burned. Dr. Felix's surgical diary was hidden and didn't surface until 300 years later. The autopsy report was buried until 1891. Even the perfume import records were erased. For over 4 centuries, the official story was that Louis XIV died naturally and peacefully, maintaining his divine image right until the end. French historians participated in what might be the most successful royal cover-up in European history. The truth about the Sun King's horrific 30-year decline into a rotting, gangrenous nightmare was successfully hidden from the world. Until 1987, when researchers finally decoded those secret medical records and revealed the full scope of this medical and royal disaster. Modern medical experts who have studied the case confirm that every single one of Louis XIV's conditions could have been prevented with basic hygiene and proper medical care. The anal fistula that started this nightmare? Completely treatable with 17th century surgical techniques if they had acted quickly instead of trying medieval torture methods. The dental catastrophe? Completely unnecessary. Tooth decay was manageable, and mass extraction was already considered barbaric by medical standards of the time. The gangrene that finally killed him? Preventable with basic wound care and hygiene. Even his weight gain and digestive issues could have been managed with dietary changes that were well understood in the 17th century. This entire 3-decade nightmare was the result of absolute monarchy's arrogance and the belief that divine kings were above the basic medical and hygienic practices that could have saved him. Louis XIV literally died in a manner more degrading than the poorest peasant in his kingdom, all because his absolute power made him believe he was above the natural laws that govern human biology. The irony is absolutely staggering. Here was a man who spent his entire reign projecting an image of divine perfection, of godlike beauty and power, who ended up as a cautionary tale about the limits of human authority against the basic realities of mortality and medicine. The Sun King, who believed his body was a temple to be worshipped, became a rotting monument to the dangers of unchecked power and medical ignorance. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story is how successfully it was covered up. For over 400 years, the world believed the carefully crafted myth of Louis XIV's peaceful death. History textbooks taught generations of students about the glorious Sun King without mentioning that he spent the last 30 years of his life as a walking biological disaster. This wasn't just a medical horror story. This was a systematic deception that shaped how we understand one of history's most powerful figures. The real Louis XIV wasn't the golden god of popular imagination, but a tragic figure whose absolute power couldn't save him from the consequences of ignorance, pride, and spectacularly bad medical advice. The lesson here isn't just about medieval medicine or royal vanity. It's about how power can create bubbles of delusion so complete that they literally kill the people inside them. Louis XIV had the resources to get proper medical care, but his absolute authority meant that no one could tell him his doctors were incompetent butchers who were making everything worse. In the end, the most powerful man in 17th century Europe died alone, in agony, with his body falling apart around him, betrayed by the very system of absolute authority that he had spent his life perfecting. The Sun King's light was extinguished not by enemy armies or political rivals, but by his own refusal to acknowledge that even divine kings are subject to the basic law of human biology and proper medical care. And the fact that this truth was hidden for over 4 centuries, that might be the most shocking part of all. It shows just how powerful the mythology of absolute monarchy was, and how far people were willing to go to preserve the illusion of divine perfection, even centuries after the divine king himself had rotted away to nothing. So the next time someone talks about the glorious Sun King and his magnificent reign, remember this story. Remember that behind the golden facade was a 30-year medical nightmare that was so horrific it had to be covered up for 4 centuries. Remember that absolute power doesn't just corrupt. Sometimes it literally rots you from the inside out,